that really made me wonder, why am I not thinking about forks on my plate? And now I'm sitting here writing the number 30. I don't even know why I'm writing 30. It's layer 3 information. So pray for me, my friends. I have something going on with my mind. So layer 2 header. Layer 2 depends on what kind of network you're going across. I gave some examples right here. Ethernet, frame relay, PPP or multi-link PPP, 6 bytes of header. So we'll say we're sending this across, let's say it's a WAN link. You know, Ethernet we're not usually as concerned about the bandwidth. WAN links we are. So that's another 6 bytes of header information, and that's our layer 2. So let's total those guys up. 160 plus 40, we've got 200, so that's 206 bytes of data per frame. So this is again data per frame we've totaled up so far for G.711 going across a PPP WAN link. If you are tunneling your traffic, you have some bonus overhead to calculate in there. GRE or L2TP tunnels, not used as often. L2TP is usually a Microsoft client or style of VPN. Those are going to add about 24 bytes of header information. If you're running across an MPLS network, that's a type of tunneling. It adds a 4-byte tag to the front of your packet. So MPLS, we have to include that. IPsec is the doozy. Look at that. IPsec is 50 to 57 bytes of data, depending on what kind of encryption and levels of hashing you're using and things like that. But that's a lot. I mean, think about it. We were talking about a G711 packet, 206 bytes per frame, right? You run that across the VPN, you're jumping that up to minimum 256 bytes per frame. That's, I mean, when we look at the final calculation of calculating all the bandwidth in there, that's a pretty significant factor. That's about what, a fifth or a sixth increase in size for that packet. So let's run this. Let's say we are running. Here's our scenario: G.711 ULAW, which is our 64 kilobits per second. Over a PPP, well, why would we be running a PPP VPN WAN link? We'll go with it, right? Let's say that we are running a PPP WAN link, and we're so security conscious that I don't even trust my dedicated T1 service provider. I want to run a VPN over. It's possible you could do it. A VPN over your PPP WAN link to make sure that all of the data between your endpoints are encrypted. So here we go. We're now up to a total of 256 bytes per frame of data that we're sending. All right, now let's put all of those criteria together and figure out how much bandwidth we're going to end up having per voice call over our PPP VPN WAN link. We've got a packet size, let me grab my pen here, packet size of 256 bytes. And just to review, we got all that by taking the sample size. We looked at our router, and the router told us that the sample size is 160 bytes for the audio. We took 160 bytes plus the 40 for the IP, UDP, and RTP headers, plus the 6 for the PPP headers that are going to go across our WAN link, plus the 50 for the VPN headers, since we're running a encrypted connection over our WAN link, and that gave us our packet size of 256 bytes. Now we need to multiply that by, you can see packet size, total bandwidth is packet size times packets per second. So we're going to take our 256 bytes and multiply it by packets per second. Well, how do we figure that out? How many packets per second are being sent? Well, think it through. We've got G711 audio, which has a 20 millisecond sample size, right? So 20 milliseconds per packet. We know that there's 1,000 milliseconds in a second. That's the definition of a millisecond. So if we take 1,000 milliseconds divided by 20 milliseconds per packet, that tells us that there has to be 50 packets sent, 50 packets per second sent in order to give us a second of audio. Isn't that amazing? Think about that. Just talking for 1 second. If you pick up the phone and say, hi, that's 1 second of audio. It takes 50 packets to generate that 1 millisecond of audio. Mind-blowing. So anyway, we've got 256 bytes per packet times our 50 packets that we're sending per second. So, I can't do that in my head. Let's do 50 times 256. That gives us 12,800. 12,800. So that's bytes per second, right? Because this is 256 bytes times 50 packets per second, each one containing 256 bytes. So we are sending 12,800 bytes per second. But we don't talk that way in network terms. We talk in bits per second, right? So our final calculation here, I've got 1280 or 12,800 bytes per second. How many bits are in a byte? 8, right? So 1280, let me get my calculator back, times 8 bits in a byte, that's 102,400. 102, whoa, getting sloppy there. 102,400 bits per second, or if we were to convert that to something more familiar, kilobits per second, that's about 102.4 kilobits per second. Insane! 102 kilobits per second per call going across the WAN link that's using VPN over a PPP connection. That's not very good. At least compared to the old PBX world. The PBX world, every single call was 64 kilobits per second. So we're actually at a disadvantage if we're using G.711 over a encrypted VPN PPP WAN link. Now, given my scenario is a little wacky off the wall, but at the same time, well, let's make it a little more realistic. I mean, what if we didn't have the 50? What if we just ran G711 over a PPP WAN link? Well, that would take us to 206. Lost my 6 there. 206 bytes per packet. Let's do a quick calculation. 206 times the 50 packets per second times the 8 bits in a packet. So, without the VPN, throw the VPN out. Let's just put with VPN. And it would be, what was it, 82.4. Oops. Without VPN. So, still, 82.4 kilobits per second, we're still not where the PBX system was. So what does that tell you? Well, in order to be competitive with the PBX vendors, if you're sending audio over a WAN link where you're bandwidth sensitive, you want to make sure to compress that. Don't use G711 uncompressed audio. Use G729. So that's what I challenge you to do. Run a calculation yourself. Here's your criteria. You're using G729, which you saw from the output of the router. G729 runs at 8,000 bits per second. So 8 kilobits per second for G729, and you're using a 20 millisecond sample size. Run that calculation. See how much G729 would cost you, how much bandwidth would be used if you're using G.729 over a PPP WAN link. I'll give you the answer on the summary slide. But before we do jump to the summary slide and I run through that G729 calculation with you, you got to do it yourself, by the way. Make sure you do it because you need to be able to do that kind of thing on your own. But anyhow, bandwidth savings measures. There are 2 of them that we can employ that can save a calculatable and significant amount of bandwidth on our WAN links. The first is VAD, voice activity detection. What that will do is suppress silence in the conversation. When you're talking on the phone, typically there are moments of silence. Now I'm almost purposely doing it in how I'm talking right now. Between sentences, as you're thinking, like if you say, "Oh, we're going to be going," oh, where was that? Oh yes, we were going to be going to the basketball game this weekend. That's right. That's what do you hear that? There's little gaps of silence that I'm having between each one of those sentences. Well, VAD suppresses those, and they actually did a study and found that in normal conversation on a T1 line, meaning 24 active calls, when they enabled VAD, they got about 35% bandwidth savings. That's a lot. That's amazing to me to think about. Every single conversation on average is 35% silence. Now, depending on where you are in the world, your mileage may vary on that. You may get 20% or 40%, or who knows? You have to calculate this for yourself because in different cultures, in different areas of regions, there's different styles and even personalities. Some people are just naturally more quiet than other people. Some languages have a naturally more flowing conversation than others where there's gaps and silence and so on. So you may have to run some tests on that yourself to see what exactly you're getting for your culture, if you will, of your company. Second one where you can calculate some savings is compressed RTP. We'll talk about this specifically in the quality of service section, but CRTP is a system that actually compresses the 40 bytes of RTP and UDP headers, takes RTP and UDP, and compresses those headers down to 2 to 4 bytes. Now, it doesn't actually compress them, it actually strips them, but I'll talk about more of that when we get to the quality of service section. You can get around 40% bandwidth savings if you're using G729 codec. I couldn't really throw a flat figure out there because this is headers, and the amount of savings, the percentage that you get, really depends on how big the audio is. Like in G729, you have a much smaller audio payload than with G711, where you have, we were running some of those calculations. It could be 240 bytes of payload versus the header. So the percentage actually depends on what codec you're using. But both of those can save you bandwidth. And that brings us to the summary. Using all those factors, whether it being the codec, the header overhead, or the bandwidth savings calculations, you should be able to pinpoint per call how much bandwidth is being used over your WAN link whenever you're deciding voice over IP. Then, of course, the final calculation you have to figure out is, well, how many calls do I think will be running over that WAN link at a given time? Multiply them all together, and that will tell you the exact amount of bandwidth you can be expecting. Now, before I wrap things up, I do want to run through that calculation with you, I promise you. If you haven't done it yourself, try it now. I said G.729 is the audio codec that's being used, which is 8 kilobits per second. And I was using a 20 millisecond sample size that was running over a PPP WAN link, right? Those were all the factors and criteria. See if you can figure that out yourself. I'm going to work through it right now. G.729, first off, I told you it was 8 kilobits per second and a 20 millisecond sample size, which was a little different than the criteria I gave you before with G711. If you look back, with G711, I gave you the bytes per sample because that is what was given here. You have to type in bytes per sample, but maybe we're trying to figure out in milliseconds. Well, first thing we've got to figure out for G729, I said it was a 20 millisecond sample size, or I guess you could see that is 0.02 seconds sample size that's being used, times the codec bandwidth, which was 8,000 bits per second, divided by 8, and that will give us how many bytes per sample G.729 will use. So before I gave you with G711 how many bytes per sample, and we figured out the sample size, so we're doing a little different this time. So I'll take that. That's 0.02 times 8,000 equals 160 divided by 8. That will end up giving me 20. So 20 milliseconds of G729 audio is actually 20 bytes of information. So 20 bytes per sample, right? Now I need to take that. Let me jump back to my summary slide. I need to take that. I know I've got 20 bytes per sample. Add in all the header overhead. So 20 bytes plus the 40 bytes of IP, RDP, UDP, all of that. So now I'm up to 60. Plus the 6 bytes for the PPP WAN link. I'm at 66 bytes per sample. So got that information. So 66 bytes per sample. How many samples per second? Well, if each one is 20 milliseconds of audio, and I have 1,000 milliseconds of audio in a second, let's just hit those calculations again. So 1,000 divided by 20, that was the 50 samples per second, times 66 bytes per sample. That gives me 3,300 bytes per second that are being sent, or if I multiply that by 8, that's 2640, or 26,400, 26,400 bits per second, because we multiplied it by 8. So in kilobits per second, that would be 26.4 kilobits per second of audio that each call using G.729 would take, which is significantly less than the 64 kilobits per second of a traditional PBX system. So there it is, the answer to the calculation for G.729. So to wrap everything up, we have looked at all the criteria that go into planning your audio payload or your audio bandwidth, choosing the codec and sample size, adding in the header if you're running across a VPN, all of that header overhead, and calculating the total voice over IP bandwidth for your network. I hope this has been informative for you, and I'd like to thank you for viewing.